Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you're not too sleepy after your lunch. The first session this afternoon is the first of two sessions titled Waterscapes and Cityscapes. Scapes 1, the first. And there's a common theme in the sense that the named towns in the programme have Viking-Age associations, Dublin, Limerick and Cork. Speakers won't necessarily be talking about a period of time. And then the speaker who doesn't name a town doesn't need to because she knows about all of them. That's the first speaker. And the other link between the four speakers is that they all have some association with the city of Cork. So you'll be getting the version of town life and so on from the real capital of Ireland. The first speaker is Dr. Rebecca Boyd. She is a Viking-Age expert. She's done wonderful work on Viking-Age houses. There's a recently published book on that subject. We owe a lot to Patrick Wallace, the former director of the National Museum, about the construction of the houses, the nature of the houses. What Rebecca has done, as she talked about that as well, but she's also done very important work on the idea of how the houses were lived in, how they were used by people, and that's really a major contribution that's so far to that subject. Her title is Beyond the Riverbanks, Archaeological Insights into Ireland's Viking-Age Towns.
Hear me now? So thank you, Howard, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm going to start off by saying that I thought I was going to be a rogue archaeologist, but I can see that's actually, I feel better. What I'm going to talk about today is a theme that kind of came through the research and the writing of my book that I really wasn't expecting to come. And it was the idea of the importance of the rivers in framing early urban life in Ireland's Viking-Age towns. And as Howard said, you know, I generally talk buildings and houses and construction and all sorts of details like that. So I really wasn't expecting to have a talk or to write so consistently about rivers and the importance of rivers. But it really shouldn't have been a surprise to me because we're talking about this crowd, the Vikings, who are notoriously water-faring, sea-going people. And there is a long debate, which I won't go into today, about who and what makes a Viking. Whether or not they wear the pointy helmets that you see on the Viking splash tour outside, or whether or not they were raiding or trading or came from a particular part of Norway or Sweden or Denmark. But the one definition that I really like at the moment is the idea that Vikings are traveling. For whatever purpose, whether that's raid or trade, whether that's for political movement, mobility, social mobility, to claim new land somewhere, but Vikings are actively moving all the time. And of course, they're moving along waterways, along rivers, coasts, and sea. We usually associate this sort of movement, Viking movement, with something like the sea stallion, traveling internationally across the Irish Sea, across the Atlantic, to Newfoundland, to Iceland, or just between Denmark and Sweden, Denmark and Norway. Great distances or small distances. But they, of course, travelled along rivers just as much as they travelled along the coast. This came out really strongly a couple of years ago in a book by Kat Jarman called River Kings, where she explored how the Vikings travelled along the river Volga into Ukraine and Eastern Asia. And she really brought to the idea that rivers are equally as important in Viking travel. And here in Ireland, we're probably all, hopefully, all familiar with the idea of the Longfort, that initial Viking raiding camp that we have at Woodstown and Waterford, Cork here in Dublin, and other sites dotted around the country. They're all located on rivers, and our 5 Viking-Age towns, again, on rivers. But I think when we talk about rivers in the Viking towns, probably are thinking more about this sort of picture. The idea of the docks, formal constructed docks like these ones in drawing. And maybe we can think of these as pieces of structural engineering. You know, these are pieces of infrastructure, levees, docks, quaysides designed to retain the water, to control the flow of movement. But they're also equally complex social places. They're places of economic trade, places of interaction between local people and foreigners, between visitors, traders. And while these are probably more properly called later Hiberno-Norse or indeed Anglo-Norman docks, if we encompass the definition of Vikings being about movement and travel, we could still call Viking docks if we wanted to go down that road. Of course, these are archaeologically visible at Wood Quay, but also in Cork, on South Main Street, various parts excavated. And we get these lovely little snippets from the archaeology. At one of the quaysides that was excavated in Cork, they found a set of 5 oak planks, which were actually part of a ship's hull from 12th century. When they chronologically dated them, they realized that this ship actually was built with English oak. But this is a ship that moved forwards and backwards between a forest. It was the wood came from a forest in Kent, came back to the end of its life in Cork and was ultimately broken up and incorporated into the dock itself. We can also think of the docks as places of regulation, rules, of legislation, places of trade, of taxation, as much as trade. So there are all sorts of complex social interactions that happen in these places. What I want to do is move a little further back in time to our very first urban level, first establishment. And I'm going to start with Cork, not because I now live in Cork. I'm not from, I'm from Wicklow, but I do live in Cork. But because this is the latest evidence that we have so far, so from the 60s to 70s. And as you can see on the map here, hopefully, the River Lee of Cork at this point in time, just this series of sandbanks, mud flats. We have St. Finbarr's here. This is the monastic settlement here on the southern bank. But our first evidence for claiming this land is this series of platforms and bridges and fences that were excavated on South Main Street. It's underneath a surface car park at the moment. It's not a very exciting prospect, but it's these docks that show the intention people who are living there to claim this land, to take it from sandbank and construct habitable platforms where they could intentionally build houses. So when we're talking about our very first construction of land, construction of habitation in Cork, we're talking about an engagement with the river, understanding the river, understanding how to build these platforms on these shifting sandbanks and controlling that river. Move to Waterford next, slightly earlier date, 1040s, although we'll see publication of the results of Mission Crawford excavations in Cork, we might push it a little bit further backwards there. And again, it's the engagement with the river here, the river shore, and then just snaking in around here, the Dons River. And it's at the confluence here, this point of the famous Viking triangle, as Waterford Council like to promote it, where we see our very first settlement here at Reginald's Tower, are in the region of Dundorry. And the settlement snaking outwards, extending outwards from this initial point on this ridge of high land, outwards in these different stages, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it's this very regularized, ordered settlement of streets and laneways. Very different in nature from Dublin, with much more organic street pattern. And I wonder if this is because of the natural geology, the natural topography of this, just lends itself to this ordered layout from. Interestingly, there's nothing here on the land during the period. The earliest dates for this line here, this and the river is 15th to 17th century reclamation. So that reclamation doesn't happen much later. And I do wonder if this is something to do with existing, or with the lack of existing settlement area, part of Waterford. Whereas in Cork, we're dealing with, say, bin bars, their landing holdings, with other existing ecclesiastical estates. Around in Dublin, we have the Michael, the enclosure, whereas this is kind of novo settlement. Perhaps the expansion out from the point, simple to just take the good land going. There was nothing to constrain that settlement. But what I want to talk about next is this idea of how can we engage with the rivers themselves? How can we think about the water itself, water in motion? And when I was looking, I found this lovely little book, very small little book. It's very easy to read, which is nice, a nice change for academics sometimes. And in it, Matt Edgeworth talks about the idea of rivers as water in motion, water in flow, flowing backwards and forwards through the natural landscape. But of course, it's also being altered continuously. The flow of water is being altered by human control, cultural actions, by by our interventions with that water. And he calls these rivers as an entanglement, cultural and natural force, intertwining both the human and the physical landscapes in the riverbed. We can also think about how the interactions between rivers and roadways, how important they are, and rivers as crossing boards, with this lovely illustration, the hurdles, Johnny Ryan. And given that, as I mentioned earlier, rivers are as natural a way for Vikings to travel as roads, we must have to start thinking about how the flow of goods, of people, of information starts to move from towns, from these points where routes, both road and river, intersect, move backwards through the rivers into the interior island. Edgeworth also suggests that we could apply this same idea of flow and motion and movement to roads, that roads also enable flow, that communications move backwards. And roads are quite different, I think, what we see in the picture, which is a street. Roads and streets, they both connect A and B, but a road travels through space, through countryside. As when we're within the town, these become streets because they have things for both sides. We think of the roads as means of communication, of travel, that flow of movement. We can think of the buildings themselves as being the riverbanks, as regulating the flow of information, the flow of people, the way people move through and around the town. People can flow in a fast pace or at a slow pace, and that can be regulated by the boundaries, by walls around the town, by gates within the wall, by fences around properties. As you see here, no fences around the property. These all impact on how people move, negotiate through the town and around the spaces. We can think as well about whether or not this flow of people could have changed from morning to evening. Were mornings busier? Was there a different segment of the population active at night? I have a teenage boy at home. He never goes to bed. So do we have different populations, different behaviours at night in the town? Or does this change seasonally? Are they busier in the summer, during prime sailing time, trading time, quieter in the winter? It's all things to think of, a different way of conceptualizing movement and rivers within. And I want to move back a little bit further, just for my last. This is a picture of the River Loire, France. And it's the second theoretical angle I came at. And this is work by Joelle Burnoff, who was looking at the explosion of towns along the River Loire, Fifth and the Thames. And she calls these river towns. Says that these places developed, these towns developed interactions with the river resource. And those resources are obviously, as I've said several times, transport, communication, but also the potential for energy, or a source of hydraulic energy, as fisheries, as resources for gathering plants and animals for use in the town. So Burnoff has suggested that river towns on the Loire lies through control of these interactions with the river, human environment interventions, like constructing weirs, levees, bridges, setting out fishing rights, navigational rights to these waters, and that these interactions created new patterns in the spaces in and around the towns, in and around the rivers, ultimately resulting. So I want to come backward to the 9th century Dublin. Unfortunately, Dublin is the only place where we have 9th century settlement. Or Limerick, same ground. And we have two different settlement focuses in the archaeology of 9th century Dublin. We have the Blackpool here, which is where we have our London pulled up their ships, their great big sea stallion ships, and repaired them. We have Viking furnished burials, swords and spears and shields. Then over here, we have just normal, ordinary houses. We have two very different types of settlement here. But it is, as you see, of course, in the crook between the River Liffey and the River Poddle. And what I want to suggest is that these two different settlements may have grown up around the same time, but they both represent different interactions with the river. The Blackpool, the dominance of saying we are Vikings, whereas at Temple Bar West, the differential nature of settlement might be more related to the way people are trying to interact with the river as a source, as a resource for fishing, perhaps, or for energy, as a resource for undertaking productive work, because there's evidence for metalworking in our West. So it's a different, I think this is a different sort of engagement in these settlements. But what that engagement is about creating flood banks, it's about defining the habitable land from the river, and these other sites around here, evidence of banks, plans of banks and ditches. What we have is this additional series of interactions, this riverine environment, creating what I think becomes this river town effect here, that establishes our baseline for what Viking Dublin became 10th, 11th, 12th, and what we're standing in right now. And I want to just finish with the idea of how rivers connect us. How we've talked a lot about the outward expansion, but also I think we need to think about how connected to their hinterlands, their local areas, their local regions, and think about those connections moving rather than road. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And that's a very important point that she's making at the end there, that the differential use of rivers, and in the case of Dublin, the Poddle could be used for one set of purposes, the Liffey could be used for a different set of purposes, and yet they are different rivers. So there's some interesting thought there. Right, we move on to Sarah McCutcheon, our next speaker. She's a graduate of University College Cork, and she's done very important work on Waterford and New Ross in the past, on excavations, drainage works, and she's also done important work by representing Kilmallock as a walled town in the Walled Town Network, which was founded 20 years ago now, and she's moved onto that, onto Limerick as well. A much bigger place, of course, in that context. Sarah's title is Limerick City, an island stronghold, a port, flood risk, a playground. Sarah McCutcheon.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I'm very grateful to be here, and it's great to talk about Limerick. My main texts for the lecture are the Historic Towns Atlas, which we're very lucky to have for Limerick, and the wonderful excavations from King John's Castle. But most particularly, all of this lecture is based on the work for many years of my colleague Brian Hodkinson, who was a curator in the museum and had been involved in the excavations through the 90s. Brian is constantly thinking, researching, and developing new ideas about the city. And so I'm just parroting here. So just to give you some context, you all know the Shannon and how far up through the country it goes, and such a large river. Its effect in Limerick was twofold, which I'll explain in a minute. It really was only an internal road in Viking times, and then later in the 18th century, it actually restricted internal trade. So what you're looking at here is just to give you an overview of the Shannon itself for the purposes of the lecture. This is the route of the Shannon, its natural route. This is the head race of the Ardnacrusha Falls. Here is Limerick, the island. You can just see faint traces here of the canal system from the 18th century that did once again connect Limerick with the interior of the island. This map from the Historic Atlas series also shows how completely enveloped Limerick was with the river. Like it had a very strong relationship, and like most intimate relationships, it could be fractious at times, but in other times it could be joyous. The other thing you've got to realize about Limerick is that it is tidal, and that tide alone can be up to 5 meters. It's quite an impressive river. And the other thing then is just where the town was sited eventually, is what they call the Corrigar Falls, which is a rock shelf, which actually stops any large vessels going up any further up through the river, not only after tide. And there you have the opposite. And that's just high tide. That's not even extra water, or nowadays when the ESB has to leave off extra water out of the Ardnacrusha Dam or a prevailing southwesterly wind, it can get very scary. Again, on the topography, you see on the LiDAR there, it is also showing, I'm in my purple patch, so you know, the height differential is showing as well, that the island itself had a narrow ridge along the southern end of it. And so we get to the Vikings. You're correct, Rebecca. We have hopefully identified the Athlonkert here in Ferry Hill in the townland over in the Clare side of the river. And this outlined in purple here is also called Athlonkert townland. This area is the Lax Weir, which was very important all through the medieval period. Here is the wonderful island of King's Island. It actually has 3 townlands, but it's referred to as King's Island. The Abbey River coming down and joining back into the Shannon. I'm from Cork, so I don't have the same reverence. I see the Abbey River as just a weak spot on the bank of the Shannon, but it's sorry. But it has a lot of tradition going with it, and there's a whole section of society, the boatmen and the fishers on the Abbey River. And so there, the little hotspot there is the Corrigar Falls, and you can see the Thomond Bridge was erected above those. So we get to our Viking town, and again, I'm paying total tribute to Brian here, who came up with the theory that unlike, there's your Nicholas Street that you would be more familiar with, that the early Viking town had a main street that was far closer to the shoreline, and that lanes led down to the shoreline, where it was very easy to just beach your boat. Again, we're lucky that Brian had such an intimate knowledge of the Nordic culture, because he worked in Norway for a long time. The importance of the dune paths, which would be outside the town itself, and the possible market area. It's solved because it was always said Brian had donated St. Mary's Cathedral to the church. It doesn't really make sense when it was originally and if it was started as a Viking temple or an early church, the idea of the main front door makes far more sense. And probably it goes back to the main street, the main street. So that's theory is that in fact after the O'Briens took the town from the Vikings, they established their palace even to the north of where King John's Castle is today. And it's now St. Munchin's, and St. Munchin was a very close saint for the O'Brien family. And I guess their farewell to the city was to hand their palace area over to the church so that the Normans couldn't get it, which was good thinking. The only physical trace in Limerick that we have of this Hiberno Norse culture is the semi-underground houses. I come from Waterford, so I call sunken featured structures, and there's all different terms for them. This is a reconstruction of what we found in Waterford, and these are the ones that were found outside what is seen as the core town of the Viking era, up in the sort of marketplace and the castle. And just before we move on, this sort of ring area here is the first ring work, just to see it in relation to where the Viking sunken featured structures are found. That's the first ring work of castle that erected by the Normans at the end of the 12th century. There was no bridge all through that period until the late 12th century when the Normans came, because they literally had to ford the Abbey River to get into the town. They obviously constructed something during their short period there, because they crossed over a bridge to leave the town, and it was promptly destroyed behind them by the Irish. And there was, I think that was Ball's Bridge, and it would have started a bridgehead and started the southern suburb, which we know today as Irishtown. And there are various versions of it. I came across this one. Brian said he's used to seeing it, but I do love the two different versions. This is very formal, and then the other artist just came around the corner and you can actually see what's going on down in the river, which is kind of nice. Thomond Bridge also. There are references to the bridge in the 1200s, early 1200s, but again, it's on a rock shelf, and it's likely that the early bridge had stone piers with wooden trestles between it. But by 1360, we're fairly sure by 1360, Thomond Bridge, as it remained to the 19th century, was constructed. This top drawing is done by Payne in the 1840s before he built the new bridge that we know today. And there's a lovely drawing of the old bridge as well in the atlas. Moving on to the castle, then when the Normans left, and when they came back in the late 1190s after the death of Donald Moore, they started constructing the castle, and we've a lot of information on that. Again, it faced out onto the river, and it was close to the crossing point in Thomond, where Thomond Bridge was going to be built, and as a protective measure. Castle also had a water gate in its final building. So there's a whole series of phases of the castle, which I'm just going to flick through here. It developed over time and was pretty much complete by the mid 13th century, but then later this bastion got added in the 17th century. And I think you'll agree it's a very impressive structure. So just to recap then, this is the area of the Viking town, very coordinated onto the shoreline. Then with the building of King John's Castle, the main street had to relocate and relocated for the two bridges as well, on Thomond and Bowles Bridge at the other end. And with the building of Bowles Bridge, the town, which was probably fortified, but definitely fortified in stone in the 15th century, in Irish town, with the building of the various gates. The conundrum, you can see the main street is Broad Street, bifurcating into Mungard Street and the street leading to Kilmallock. Have to get Kilmallock in somewhere. Is West Watergate, doesn't really lead anywhere, and yet it's one of the most formal gates on the circuit. And Brian has also come up with a theory that it's because it's visible when you're approaching the port of Limerick. So it's a statement gate, really. It was excavated in the 1980s by Anne Lynch and found and published with Royal Irish Academy. I've included these two maps because I'm constantly using bits out of them, and they are a cornerstone. They're the two early maps from the Historic Towns Atlas series, and who doesn't love the Hardeman map? What's wonderful, I was saying earlier, what's wonderful is I'm old school and I still have a CD player, so I can enlarge tiny little bits of the maps to show lovely detail. So onto the port of Limerick, which was very important, but all downstream generally. And we have lovely pictorial images of it. And as well as that, what you're seeing here is the other use of the river, using actually the shelf and the Curragar Falls to make a natural weir to either side, either bank of the river. You had mills on both sides, and we have traces left of this mill. Not so much on the other side. There was also mills in the Abbey River. And you have smaller boats that would obviously be fishing and so forth. And this, I think, is possibly, yeah, we're just inside the castle there as well. So that's the Watergate. Again, this map is very good to show the layout of the harbour. You've got the Curragar Falls here and acting much more now as a weir to these two mills, the Thomond Bridge and the castle protecting all the salient parts of the city. This is a great map because I love, it's got 3 sections over in the corner, and it's just, for an archaeologist, it really makes sense of a lot of the flat plan. And it's one of the last maps that was executed before Limerick was declared an open city in 1760. And so what you're seeing there are various developments of quays within the harbour walls, and your mill building, your castle, and your town, and across the river. And the section there is actually from here to here. So there's a lovely measurement there, and the 2 different terminals of the harbour walls. And the actual river aspect of Limerick, between the castle, the cathedral, and the bridges, is a wonderful, evocative aspect recorded by artists over a period of time. This one, the lower one, is included in the Coles map from the 18th century. And in the 18th century, there was improvements in the quays, but there was also all of the Abbey River was walled, and to create new quays, and new quays the ports started to slowly slip downstream from the main core of the medieval and early Viking town. And you can see a picture of a bustling city on George's Quay. Of that new quay, in recent works, advanced works before our Kings Island flood relief scheme, we've actually made a lot of discoveries in the harbour area. It's been lovely to be involved in it because the testing has been finding masonry structures, and all of the rest is actually much later backfill. So it's been a pretty non-invasive in a way, in that we're literally just recording decent masonry structures. So we all our test trenches, we found this wall of the 18th century pier and the later 19th century extension. The other exciting find, just to mention, is the quay gate, and this area here leading up to that kind of bastion, the edge of the harbour wall. We've actually located that gate as well, which is going to be shown. It's well below ground, but it'll be picked out, hopefully. And it's that gate that's there as well. And then you're all aware in the 18th century of the wonderful Georgian extension of the town and the planned town in Perry Square. And with that, the final connection with water for Limerick, which was the building of the canal, which basically meant that Limerick could connect through to the canal system and connect to Dublin. And while this was sort of muted in a way with the arrival of the railways in the 1840s, it did continue to exist as a store, bringing Guinness boats down, and is very affectionately remembered in the local psyche. We've done works just recently on the canal harbour buildings through European and our own grants. I include this map to show cutting through the fabric of the city again to reach where had been a fording point and became a bridge to the Athlonchart Bridge. That street cut through buildings. And the other part of that map again shows very much this sort of constant drift downriver of the port. That's a picture of Arthur's Quay in the mid-19th century. And this is a picture of Arthur's Quay today. And we're getting onto our playground at this stage. And that's because the port has now moved downriver, significantly downriver to Foynes. And then the other kind of double sword, edge sword, the other cutting through the medieval city by the Northern Relief Road in the 90s. It did divorce the northern part of the city from the rest of the medieval city. And we're trying to slowly reclaim it back. And then the other huge scheme in the 90s, late 90s, is the main drainage and the Abbey River navigation. It was to try and get more, build a marina and to try and get more boating on the Shannon, lowering the river under the Abbey Bridge, the Balls Bridge, and creating a marina and a weir to keep an amount of water. It hasn't been entirely successful. The Limerick City Council took over the walkway along by the Park Canal. And there's a whole series of walkways going out to UL, up the Shannon, and along the Park Canal. The other thing is this picture here shows with the demise of the port, the edges of the river were sort of really unloved in a way, and we had a big, huge campaign, a very good boardwalk put in, connecting all three bridges in the Thomond down to the Shannon Bridge. Became incredibly popular during COVID. And then this is the fractious relationship. Unfortunately, the bond around Kings Island was breached in 2014, and catastrophic flooding of the Kings Island. We're currently looking at a much larger project. It's in its inception to do flood works for the entirety of the city. And that will mean that we will be doing public realm works all along the bank of the river on either side, hopefully to improve the public realm and to have much more interaction with the river. As it is, the works that we're doing on Kings Island flood relief scheme are underway as we speak. And it will, we're abandoning this area in a way. It does have a bond around it, but it's also an SAC. So our proper relief is coming around here in a much extended bund, which will have a lovely walkway on the top of it. And other improvements to the public realm, having more interaction with the Abbey River along the quay. And finally, we're nothing if not ambitious in Limerick. Our project is to create a world-class waterfront using a whole series of different projects, but totally interacting with the river and recognising its importance to Limerick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's good to hear that the Historic Towns Atlas fascicle was useful for you, including the work of Brian Hopkinson, who's with us today, and but also to hear about recent work and future work on what is becoming a very go-ahead city by the sounds of things, which is very good to hear. The next speaker is Barney Whelan. Barney has done an extraordinary range of things in his life, and far too many to stop for me to tell you about now. But he started off studying fisheries biology in UCD. He's the first fisheries biologist I've ever met in my life. But he's done all sorts of other things, food-related things, I suppose. And at the moment, he's an associate research fellow at the Trinity Centre for Environmental History, and he's working towards a postgraduate degree in art history at University College Cork. And he's been involved with the National Gallery here in Dublin, the vice chair of the board, and he's serving still on the board of the National Museum of Ireland. So Barney has done all sorts of things in his life, but he's now going to talk about something fishy, as he calls it, market regulation in Anglo-Norman Dublin. Barney Whelan.
And now for something completely different. Howard, it's a real honour for me to address you this afternoon at this fascinating event. And I'll speak about the authorities in Norman Dublin and how they manage the sale of food and fish. And while my main project in starting this off was dealt with disgust as a determinant of food choice, somehow I think this subject is better suited for this talk. So things changed when the Anglo-Normans arrived, and they started to write things down. So we start to see charters and ordinances and lots of different records. I just focus on this man for a little bit. He was VP of this very house. He was a historian and archivist, and he was also on the board of the National Gallery, and that meant that I had access to the minutes of the meetings he attended over a 10-year period, and he was a very regular contributor at that time. He translated these ordinances and charters and all that. They're not indexed, so you have to read through the lot to get to the relevant bits, which only gives you a really in-depth view of what life was like in those. But these documents contain a vast range of material. And basically, the laws, if you like to call it that, if they had to make a regulation or a law to control behaviours, then we can be sure that people were behaving badly some of the time. So what I'd like to do is and there was other authors of similar work from similar times, 1160, 1170 onwards. And then you just have to look across the water to York and Norwich and other similar villages and towns, and they were dealing with the same things. They were making the same ordinances, the same laws, if you like. And then, of course, there was a lot of different texts picked these up. So I love the piece there where it says medieval market morality. I just love to know what they're, well, I did read it, but there was a lot of people trying to rip a lot of people off. That was basically the size of it. But the next one beside it, urban bodies, which was really all about communal health and how that was managed. Then, of course, there's Pather Slattery's piece there, and then a piece on entrepreneurship in the Middle Ages. And then, there was one on shopping in the Renaissance, making a living in the Renaissance. And then, of course, there were a lot of books published about particular cities and the logistics of supplying those cities with food and goods. So if we take this, at this particular period, there was an increasingly urbanized and non-agricultural population. There were fluctuating harvests, there was poor transport and a lack of storage for perishables. But for the people in charge, supply and a constant supply was a prime consideration because it could lead to unrest, basically. So if we take fish as a locus for how all this business was conducted, it had always been a very serious business. You just look at these Viking hooks from Wood Quay, just to get a sense of the beautiful work that was done, and effectively, I'd say too. But by 1200, Ireland's fisheries had expanded from with a switch from mostly inshore and freshwater to mostly offshore and deep waters, and the isotope and DNA analysis bears that out. I just want to apologise in that the illustrations on this talk are generally from the continent, because we don't seem to have a good set of illustrations of this type of activity. So there must have been a large amount of fish in demand, because there was lots of fish days. There was Lent, 40 days of penance, and other special days during the year. So there's therefore lots of different fish engines, as we call them, lots of different ways to catch different species of fish. And there's a few more there, including a coastline example. This is from Aidan O'Sullivan's work on the Shannon, and it's a 700-year-old wooden fishing weir. So that's stake and wattle construction. Under the now National Convention Centre on the Liffey, there was a 2,200-year-old similar fishing weir excavated during the pre-construction excavations. And that meant that the people who had built that knew the influence of tidal flow on fisheries. They also knew how to coppice trees, because they wouldn't be able to get they'd be able to get the stakes, but the wattle is a different story. So if we look at what market stalls might have looked like at this time, if you look at the little red circle there, it shows you smoked fish. Could be herring, could be another species. And then you've got salted fish in the barrels. And I'll come on to some of the things that people used to do to get around, to save a bit of money, I suppose. But anyway, you can see there again, more salted fish and some fresh looking fish on the slab, basically. But now this is by von Valkenborsch a couple of 100 years later, and you can see here again up in the top left, you can see the smoked fish. You can see salted flounder, I think, are turbot, gutted. And then you've got salmon and cod there on the slab. And then you've got a couple of sick-looking trout in the basin in front, in the forefront. But again, just goes to show what you can glean from some of these imageries. So if we look at fish as a locus for understanding the food chain regulation, there's a lot of moving parts in this. There's import and export trade, there's procurement and supply, customs and tolls, there's fishing rights, there's an infrastructure, a place where the fish are sold and traded, a shambles, in other words. And then there's the regulation of sale prices, which I'll come to in a little while, and the processing, gutting, salting, smoking, all of that. And with that comes a need for quality monitoring. And in relation to fishing rights, then there are tithes to be collected, or levied and collected. And of course, at the end of it all, there's waste management. And here's an example of one John Dyer, a parishioner of St. Mickens, a fisherman of a boat belonging to St. Mary's Abbey, and having been charged by the prior and convent of the Holy Trinity with retaining the tithes due to them of fish caught by him in the water of Annaliffe. And the charge having been proved, sentence was given by him to the said John Dyer that he should pay the tithes. Now that was 2 salmon or 2 shillings. But wait for it. The cost of the action, the lawyer's cost, was 49 shillings. Nothing has changed in the meantime. So, and that by way of penalty for his long detention of the tithes, he should on 6 several days, up to the feast of Pentecost, be beaten round St. Mickens Church, naked saved for a loincloth by the curate. So that's just an example of a fella dodging the tithes. But anyway, the basic principles here were about protecting health, protecting political stability, ensuring public order, that there would be a reasonable profit made, a fair system of sale. And this was really about protecting the economy and protecting the reputation of the city, and also ensuring communal welfare. And public interests and preventative care were central issues at this time. There was a recognition that substandard food led to disease generation. And that meant the need for product quality and standards. The bailiffs were central to all of this. And it also meant that sanitation had to be managed and taken care of. And I'll deal a little with this environmental health thing, but we talked about the other rivers in Dublin. There were regulations that say you don't pollute these rivers, because if you do that, you'll ruin the stocks of salmon and brown trout. So they had even got to that level of thinking. So the mechanisms that were used were formal statements of local customs and laws, decrees, charters, ordinances, statutes of trade, and then latterly maybe craft guild standards. And the influences were always around tradition and practice, precedent law, health literature, not as we would know it today, very specific approach, and then of course religious law too. And formal arrangements were developed, processes for the movement and sale and purchase of goods, the collections of tolls, taxes and fines by bailiffs, physical sites, a regular marketplace and times of opening. You just look at York and Norwich, where they forbade the sale of fish anywhere other than in the shambles. And exactly the same thing happened in the Dublin context. And then there was the enforcement of contracts and debts and quality controls. So if we look at this other quote from Gilbert, part altogether from telling each householder had to clean the portion of the street by his front door. And if he didn't do that, he got a penalty of 12 pence. At one point, I identified the animal bones on Wood Quay before Finbar McCormick arrived along. And my experience of the pathways in Dublin was that there was bones sticking up everywhere. So the sense I got was that people ate the meat off the bones and threw them out the front door. But you can see here the second point is that fish shall be sold in the fish shambles only and not elsewhere. So that's about keeping this dirty activity in the one place, basically. So again, on prices, very sensitive to variations in price and the response of the citizens in that context. In other words, it must be a fair, a natural, customary price, a just price. And then on the supply side of things, they were completely focused on market manipulation. And you had three different types of characters: engrossers, forestallers, and regraters. And an engrosser was a purchaser of such quantities in the market as to raise the price. So he bought it all, he kept it in a store, and the price went up. And then he was able to go in with his product. A forestaller was a person who buys goods before they can be sold on the open market in anticipation of rising prices. And then a regrater is a person who buys commodities to make a supernormal profit. So it was all about avoiding shortages and avoiding oversupply. And here's a case where there was a prohibition of the purchase of fish by regraters, male or female, before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And there was a penalty for forestalling the city in fish meat or any food. So, and the final piece about the common good here is waste management. With the sale of food comes entrails, rodents, stenches, smells, miasma, and drains. And then humans have their own input into that, as well as the animals around the streets. And again, the protection of freshwater fish stocks in the rivers around. But I said I started off with disgust on this, but it has to come into it, because there's regular references to bad, dirty, stinking, yellow, fetid, and rusty fish, corrupt flesh. Anything that smells, looks, or cooks bad is forbidden. So it just illustrates the importance of smell in the detection of offences during this period. And so at this point, food exchange was therefore carefully policed and regulated for the common good, and it played an important role in the maintenance of public health and order during this period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barney, and thank you for reminding me of the activities of curates in medieval Dublin. Of course, that was on the north side of the river, didn't happen on the south side. Our final speaker in this group is Kieran McCarthy, and it was the pleasure and honour of Atlas people a year ago, May of last year, to attend the launch of the Atlas of the City of Cork. And it was launched by none other than the coming speaker, Kieran McCarthy, who is not only an expert on the history of the city, he was actually then the Lord Mayor of the city as well. We've never had, I think, an instance in the entire history of the Atlas of a fascicle being launched by such a person as a Lord Mayor. So that was a privilege for us. Kieran is a geographer by background, but he's still very active geographically. He conducts tours of the city, including the suburbs of the city. He's authored or co-authored 32 books about the history of Cork. So he's a remarkable person, and he's going to talk today about Cork, of course, not the Viking bit though. Later on, John Rocque's Cork, constructing identity and landscape in a mid-18th century Irish port city. Kieran McCarthy.
Dear Howard, dear members of the Atlas team, and dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the invitation to present this afternoon. And also, I want to say, I suppose the team came to Cork last year, and I'm coming to Dublin this year to say thank you so much for your work on Cork. The people of Cork really, really appreciated it. And you also came to my home to launch it, so thank you so much. And if you haven't bought the Atlas of Cork, it's outside to buy. I'm going to say that for the very, very outset. You've heard today little bits and pieces on Cork. It pops up across narratives connected to other towns and cities and settlements across Ireland. And if you glanced at the Atlas outside, you'd kind of notice that Cork's very, very blessed. It's experienced every phase of Irish urban development. So we had an early Christian monastery. We had Vikings and Hiberno-Norse kind of legacies. With an Anglo-Norman wall town, the town lasted for the bones of 400, 450 years. We took our town walls down in the 18th century. There was a massive butter and beef boom, 19th century industrialization, distilling and brewing and so on. And 20th century, 21st century suburbanization. So Cork is blessed to have like 8 or 9 layers. And for someone like myself, I've been giving tours of my city for something like 32 years since I was 16 years old. And it's a playground. And the more you dig into it, the more you get lost in it. And I think looking down at many of you here today, there are many local historians here, and hopefully you feel the same way. You like getting lost in the world. And we're very, very blessed that there's so much material now coming to the fore more and more, especially through the publication of the town atlases. My short paper is on one of my favourite maps of Cork. And there's probably, I don't know, 18, 20 core maps of Cork City. And they're all in the atlas outside. And it's called A Survey of the City and Suburbs of Cork by J. Rocque, or John Rocque in 1759. The map itself is probably like 2 A3 pages kind of put together in reality when you kind of discover it in the city library. The city library allows you to take photocopies of it, take scans of it, even though it's kind of online if you even Google this map. And I use it regularly on my walking tours because it photocopies really well, but it's also impressive in its layout, in its beauty as an artwork. Is very, very noteworthy, and it's also really different to some of the maps before this and kind of beyond into the 17th century. The Hardyman collection maps have already been shown from Limerick, for example, 2 papers ago. And on a tour, it's a map that's readable, it's understandable by the general public in our time. You can even overlay Ireland survey maps actually on it, and it is crying out for an augmented reality event. If Andrew's still in the room, please come to Cork. Historically, by John Rocque survey in 1759, the walls of the town are just a memory. The medieval plan was now part of something larger. You can see in the heart there. You can see the herringbone. The town walls you can see are long gone. There's now something larger going on within the town of Cork. It's certainly in terms of population, between 1700 and 1759, 1720,000 people. By this map, you're talking the bones of 73,000 people. So the people who lived in this world, like they just saw more and more people coming to Cork, and basically on the back of a butter boom that was actually spoken about in the Tralee context kind of earlier on. And also, the interesting thing about this particular plan is that up to that, maybe between what I called the Vikings in 1759, there was always like protection of the city from the water. By 1759, it's like the city is taking the battle to the edge of the water and at the edge of the swampland. Like the city is built across 16, 17 kind of marshy islands. And Rebecca's work and her comments about living on the edge is very much kind of reflected in what kind of John Rocque is trying to negotiate here and narrate, and that's kind of what I want to comment on. This is a world where there are new communities rising in the guise of rising Protestant merchant class, French Huguenots, third generation Cromwellian Quakers, creating new economic, social and cultural landscapes. I just want to zoom in very quickly maybe on 2 aspects. One is the cartographer himself. We are very, very, very blessed to have a good amount of biographical material available on John Rocque, and it's notable because in many cases in Irish cartographies in cities and towns, we know nothing about their cartographers. Like they came around one day and they surveyed and mapped and they kind of went home. But John Rocque is very, very different. And much of the work on John Rocque has been derived and driven by this house as well over many, many, many years. His background, John Rocque, is impressive. He was born in France in 1704, one of 4 children. As a Huguenot, fled first to Geneva and then somewhere around 1709 to England. Trained as a surveyor, map maker, engraver, map seller. Was involved in some way in gardening. as a young man, living with his brother Bartholomew, who was also a landscape gardener, originally producing plans for formal gardens, consisting of symmetrical patterns made up of plant beds and low hedges, or trying to kind of draw gravels on maps. He produced several plans of gardens across England, Rest Park, Claremont, Paynes Hill, Surrey, Wainstead House, Wilton House, and the work on the gardens led him to get a contract for a survey of London. And it resulted in a 16-sheet map of London. Now, I wanted to comment briefly, this is just, I'll come back to some of this in a second, but this is the London map and the different plans. Now, you can see it's blurred, it's online if you want to zoom in even more. But this is also different to other kind of plans and post-medieval plans of London. It's clear that Rocque's gardening expertise is very present in his detail of trees and riding tracks and water in the form of rivers, more so that he uses shaded blocks to represent buildings. Indeed, the map looks like one big garden if you actually go down on top of it and actually look at the different sheets itself. His work brought him to the attention of the Prince of Wales in 1751, Frederick, and unfortunately there was a fire destroyed much of Rocque's London premises, but after that he was employing 10 people in another premises, and he actually brought out a publication called the Small British Atlas, being a new set of maps of all the counties of England and Wales. And interestingly, there's a potential engraving of him as a map maker just there on the left. In fact, some of his maps he actually shows surveyors. Now, I'm not too sure did he sketch himself. This could be part of his team, but it's interesting that he puts a focus on the people kind of doing the work. And as I said, like 1750s London, there's 10 people actually working for him. So it's nice to know that he didn't do all the work. There was a team actually with him. It was only a matter of time when the name Rocque would spread to Ireland. Between 1754 and 1760, he did some work for James Fitzgerald, the 20th Earl of Kildare, and of course the late John Andrews of this particular house was heavily involved in kind of republishing much of those particular plans. John Rocque also led a commercially driven projects doing Dublin, Cork and Kilkenny. He first visited Dublin in August 1754, and he kind of mapped the city and then kind of the wider suburbs. And actually prior to after Dublin, he did Kilkenny. And actually in this post-Cork work, he ended up working in the British colonies, kind of mapping out fortifications and towns over there. And that kind of brings us kind of nicely back to this. So that's you might have seen the Dublin one. In fact, there's a book also on sale outside on the left-hand side on John Rocque's Dublin. Have a look at that. I can't plug the Academy anymore for you. John Rocque's Kilkenny. But again, just looking at it just generally, it does look like one big garden. It's like his focus is just very, very different than the post-medieval plan of Kilkenny. This is just the out page for John Rocque's America in 1765. At this particular point in time, I think he'd also passed away in 1762, so this is probably done by his team. And this kind of leads us back to John Rocque's Cork. Now, I like playing with this particular map. As I said, it's my favorite map because anywhere you kind of twist it around, you kind of see different kind of views in it. And as a geographer by trade, I was told to my undergrad, like, maps tell lies. And they kind of draw you into different things. And John Rocque, I have to say, he's clever. So when you do a walkthrough of his map, this particular map has to be thought about in this context of being a Huguenot, a gardener, a surveyor, an imperial cartographer, a consultant, because he's paid to do this by the Corporation of Cork, the Mayor of Cork. And members of which he would have known as well. I can tell you 1750, many of the mayors of Cork were formerly Huguenots and so on. John Rocque gives us ideas of what landscape means to him. We access his gaze, his mind's eye. The end product's not only functional as a map, but also his contemplation of the geography of the physical topography and how his ideas actually were organised. And certainly comparing his works, John Rocque views cities as an integrated ecosystem like one big garden. The 1759 survey of Cork looks like one big garden full of different features to attract the eye and to engage with, complete with personality, political and urban philosophies, paths, water, public kind of centrality points. Indeed, though, if you walked in reality across this city in 1759, And there's enough surviving accounts of it. I think somebody mentioned Charles Smith's kind of history of our country this morning from 1750. This map gives you no sense of the stench within some of the waterways you see here. Gives you no, in fact, some of his map on the left by the quay, his map does cut off some of the slums. There's just, he puts a different foci. There's just different foci that he maps onto. He does. There's no reflection on penal law enforcement, the business of people and trade. There was 100,000 barrels of butter exported from Cork in this particular year, 1759. There was 60,000 barrels of beef. There was like 50,000 cattle cut up in shambles in the northern hills of the city. Doesn't get you, that gives you the sense of like the noise of the barrels kind of knocking off the cobbles of the city, or the blood running down, we'd say, places like Shandon Street in the northern ridges of the city. It's very kind of clean, the map itself. In geographical speak, John Rocque's survey shows drawn, multi-layered notions of placemaking. He's trying to tell old and new stories. He's documenting the interplay between past and present. He's highlighting narratives between material and symbolic worlds. He's endorsing some old heritages and creating new ones. He's coming up with new collective memories for the city, new stories for the city. He's creating relationships to people, and I'll show some of that in a second. In essence, the Cork survey is about the negotiation of identity and place, especially Cork's place within the expanding British Empire. So this map is being rolled out in a political context. It's used to create a colonial landscape of control and order, definitely, but also controlling representation, interpretation, and also trying to capturing new narratives of people's past, present, and future. In terms of the cartography itself, the shapes, the lines, John Rocque does reveal a properly arranged landscape devoid of medieval twists and tightness of space. There's a lot of uniformity here, classical lines, symbolic of prosperity and cleanliness, humanity, prestige of the whole community. In fact, what's interesting in the centre of the map here, this main street, which is South Main Street and North Main Street, we have accounts of people throwing their rubbish onto the streets and just building up of rubbish, and epidemics sweeping across South and North Main Street, the old kind of wall town area. He just shows that it's very clean. The other element is that when you start zooming in on kind of on different things, so for example, this kind of, he puts a big block in terms of a diagram on the old custom house. So he wants to put a focus on this kind of world of mobility. There's also he focuses in on the butter market area, as you'd kind of expect to show kind of like Cork's kind of prowess within the empire. He also focuses in on what I call the playfulness of the city. What I mean by playfulness is that he shows a large block of an emerging playhouse that was built in the 1710s on what it's called Playhouse Lane, but in our time it's called in Princes Street in the city. He also kind of begins to show maybe in the centre of the map as well as a place called the Talsel, which is kind of the central market. But you can see he's drawing in kind of bigger buildings to showcase like Cork is expanding, and there's a message to that, and there's a narrative to that. In particular, the motif to the map is interesting in itself, where he shows kind of barrels of butter on the left-hand side here of this particular image. But if you look carefully, like there's an image of two Oriental people. It's like completely, I can't tell you that Cork was dealing with China in the 18th century. It wasn't, or Asian further afield, it wasn't. So there's a license taken with this map, and I know many of you here have worked with maps, and you can sometimes we're aware of that. But there's a lot of license taken right across this particular plan and map. The more you dig into it, and the more you see the playfulness of it as well. Also, there's a reference as well. So this was actually an emerging area. So he actually marks in French Church Street, French Church Lane, where actually the Huguenots used to be. And there's a good focus in the top centre of the map. So he was a Huguenot, so he does draw attention to it. Also, there's a reference as well to some of the Quaker influence. He in particular kind of puts a focus that the Quaker influence is right next to a gorgeous kind of river channel. We do know there was a number of families here, the Fenns, the Hammonds in particular, that actually were developing land. They had been around since just post-Cromwellian times, so they've been in the city for nearly 100 years. There is a nod to the poorhouse of the city, but I think it's more a nod to that there's a number of Protestant charities in the city as well. This particular poorhouse became the city's first workhouse in time, but then the workhouse got too busy over its first year and then moved to Douglas Road in the city itself. There's also kind of a nod to the House of Hanover Street. So when you start really kind of looking into this kind of particular plan, and also there's a reference, in particular, he draws this kind of great canal. And you'll see there's quaysides on either side. There's actually a drawbridge down over here. In today's context, this particular curving canal is now St. Patrick Street. And this particular street over here actually today is called Drawbridge Street. The drawbridge is long gone. It also shows it shows a canal ridden and kind of tree laden corridor, which became known as the Grand Parade. This is the South Mall is kind of over here, is the former canal. This is an emerging Morrison's Island. But the drawings are just very elaborate. They're actually very, very lush. And that's what I like about the map as well. It is a piece of art. The last thing that I want to say is that, and probably an indirect way, is that out of this sort of branding and narrative, somewhere towards the late 1700s, so maybe 20, 30 years later, after like 1759, one of the narratives of branding that began to develop in Cork was an idea of the Venice of the North. And it would be great to stand up here and point to a myriad of real physical Venetian imagery and Venetian perspectives in 18th century Cork. But this terminology seems to emerge somewhere, maybe the closing decade of the 18th century, early 19th century, and then actually probably late 20th century in some of our local history books. But Cork reputedly became part of several cities in Northern Europe, St. Petersburg, Amsterdam, Bruges, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Hamburg and Manchester, that contained canals, and all compared to the enduring connection with water in Venice, Italy, over many years. Now, this is Venice in the 17th century. The thing about it was at its height of its power in the 17th century. Venice was kind of dying a death in the 18th century, but somewhere maybe 100 years after its height, we are kind of, people in Cork and elsewhere were kind of harnessing this sort of imagery, harnessing this sort of branding. To conclude, because I know I'm just throwing a truckload of stuff out there, a survey of the city and suburbs of Cork by John Rocque provides a rich platform to enter the world of an 18th century port city such as Cork. But it's not just the survey which provokes questions on the narratives inscribed in the map, but the background of John Rocque also provides insights into the creative storyboards of each surveys and maps and what stories they were actually trying to narrate. And it's important in the history of Irish cartography on our towns and our cities that we continue to mine down into those narratives, which have created many of our really beautiful maps, and from all the different angles, and from all different angles of different disciplines as well, so that we can rightly understand their narratives and heritage and meaning in Irish history, and also appreciate the added value in our time of such maps even more. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kieran. You're quite right to highlight the quality of Rocque's mapping. He was a professional surveyor. It is a landmark in those towns and cities for which he did a map. And for Dublin, because we published Dublin in different parts, 4 parts in principle, we divided part 2 and part 3 at Rocque's map of Dublin. Now we have time for just a couple of questions because we want to keep on to schedule. So please go to the microphone. There's a gentleman there in the corridor, yes. Did you want to ask a question? Yes, over there.
My question's for the Dr. Lord Mayor, words I never thought I'd put together.
I didn't either.
I'm also an historical geographer, cartographer, and I actually used to teach a course online with maps. And I just want to thank you for that. It was a wonderful presentation. The way you're describing Rocque's map, to me, is boosterism. Boosterism, a big, perhaps a 19th century word in North America, where every city is competing with every other city to try drawing in as much money for its development as possible. And as you're going through it, I'm thinking of this whole literature on boosterism and cartography. It's a wonderful way of pitching your city for investment purposes. Did you play with that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it is a marketing ploy. It's a massive marketing ploy, his map. But what strikes me is that he's really clever and strategic with it. It's not your standard marketing map. That there's something else to it. I go back to my main point. We just need to look closer at these maps. These similar array of maps that we have in Ireland. But yeah, it is boosterism. It is like, please come to Cork and please invest. Please see this kind of gorgeous canal that you can actually sail down. Even though the reality is that we got rid of the canals because people dumped all the rubbish into the canals, and there's a massive stench, probably of fish as well, that was being thrown out. But you are right. But I think it's more than just boosterism. And the more I look at this map and the more I turn it around and the more I get out a magnifying glass, the more I'm pulled into it myself. And I'd like to think that the people who bought this map are former councillor members or former colleagues of mine that are long gone in Cork City Council, Cork Corporation, that they also enjoyed it, and that the mayor picked it up in 1750 and 1759 and went, okay, we've got the boosterism, but there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. Yeah, there's a lot going. I think my point is read between the lines of every map.
Time for one more question, please, perhaps from the other side of the house. There we are. Thank you, sir.
Hi there. Thanks very much. Can you just elaborate on what you meant by, well, first of all, the statement, public centrality points, and then maybe explain how you're extracting that from the map?
I don't know, the last few days was kind of looking more and more on the map. And his focus isn't on building. So there are. It's like sometimes in a formal garden, you see there's a space where people chat, and they have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. If you go to some of the 18th century gardens in France or the UK, I just call it public centrality paths. I could call it just central points for people to stop at. I need to do more work on this idea of that this guy was drawing a garden and connecting it to a city. And it's interesting like that in time, early 20th century, there was garden cities kind of concept emerging. But I think Rocque was onto something else that we haven't delved down more into. So when I say public centrality spaces, it's like, public spaces for people to gather. But in the context that all around them then there was like trees and ponds and gardens, canals. That's kind of what I mean by that. I've made up those words. I like boosters. I'm actually might use those words as well going forward. But thank you so much for your question.
Thank you very much. Do feel free, by the way, over tea or coffee to speak to the speakers. It's a pity we don't have more time for that. And we had one speaker this afternoon and one this morning talking about fishiness, and they reminded me of the one fact I've ever known about the history of eels, which is that in the year 1135, no less a person than the King of England, Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, died, according to the chroniclers, from a surfeit of eels. So quick cup of tea or coffee, please, and back at 3.